Hi there, Steve from Steve M Outdoors here with a video just discussing some tips that beginner reloaders should keep in mind when reloading the 303 British cartridge. So as I've touched upon in previous videos, the Lee Enfield rifles tend to be popular amongst military surplus collectors, particularly in Commonwealth countries, for a variety of reasons. And those collectors quickly learn that ammunition, though it's readily available from a number of manufacturers, tends to be relatively expensive. Anywhere from $1 to $1.50 a round, depending on the manufacturer and what kind of cartridge you're getting, obviously. Now, that quickly adds up in a day of shooting. So inevitably, some of those collectors turn to reloading the 303 British round, whether a hope for increased accuracy or just to save some money over the long haul. Now, there are some things that beginners need to understand and keep in mind when reloading the 303 British round, and hopefully this video will provide a little bit of education. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of this, I should say that while I'm dealing specifically with the 303 British cartridge and Lee Enfield rifles, you could also apply some of the things that I'll say to other calibers and rifles. A great example of this is reloading the 7.62 by 54 millimeter R round, one that's used in both the M9130 Mosin Nagant and the SVT-40 rifles. Also popular amongst military surplus collectors and reloaders. Now, the SVT can be pretty hard on brass thanks to gas issues and its fluted chamber, and it also typically sees a reduced lifespan compared to brass from, let's say, a Mosin Nagant. So my first tip is sharing brass amongst rifles. Now, many collectors own more than one Lee Enfield rifle, and they may be tempted to share brass between the rifles because a Lee Enfield is a Lee Enfield, right? Not quite. As I noted in a previous video, Lee Enfield rifles are notorious for headspace issues, basically the space between the bolt and the case head, and also loose chambers. The causes of this are numerous, bolts being interchanged between rifles over their lifetimes, manufacturing tolerances, the age of the rifle, how hard was it used. The Lee Enfield rifle was also not made to be shot with reloaded or hand-loaded ammunition. So modern brass could have a thicker or thinner rim than military spec ammunition. Now that leads to brass stretching in the chamber after detonation, and it greatly stresses the brass near the case head, which is right around here. Now eventually, particularly with full-length resizing, you'll see what's called incipient case head separation. That's a line around the brass about 1 centimeter from the head, which denotes that the case head is about to separate from the rest of the body. Or you'll actually see case head separation, which will leave the main body of the brass in the chamber, and only the case head will be extracted, and that's a pain in the ass to get out. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about this issue, there's a link to the corner of the video, one of these corners that'll be there, corner, which will take you to an earlier video where I discuss, what you need in order to resolve that issue. So a very good practice then is to separate the brass that you use from one Lee Enfield rifle from another, and only use that brass in that particular rifle. It'll increase the longevity of that brass. Speaking of brass longevity, you should know that brass from these rifles probably won't last you as long as those from other calibers and rifles. Typically I see about 4, or if I'm pushing it, maybe 5 firings from brass before I have to get rid of it or begin experiencing failures. Now again, the primary reason for this is head spacing issues. Now you can mitigate this to a certain degree by artificially reducing the head space. A common trick is to get an O-ring, a small rubber O-ring, and put it in front of the bolt face. And there are plenty of videos and articles on the web showing you how to do this. But the reality is, even with these tricks, your brass life is probably going to be reduced. So I know what you may be thinking. Steve, I've heard of annealing, the practice of heating up the brass in order to reduce brittleness and make it more malleable. Well, that should solve the problem, right? No. Remember that annealing is only to ever be done on the neck of a case, never near the case head. Simply put, different parts of a case need to be at different stages of hardness. The case head, which is made up the rim, the primer pocket, and the web, need to be very hard so that they don't deform during firing. If you anneal the case head or near it, you could actually suffer a catastrophic failure that could damage your rifle, or worse, you, and we don't need that. Now, having said all that, one way to increase the longevity of your brass is to neck size it instead of full length resize it. That just basically means that you're using a specialized die which will only resize the neck itself so that it'll hold a bullet. The rest of the case is left alone, for the most part, depending on the die, and that'll reduce stress on the brass, which means that the brass that you will have from that rifle will have been fire formed to that chamber of that specific rifle. That's the primary reason why you should only use brass neck sized from that rifle in that rifle. It may not chamber properly in another rifle, and if it does, differences in the chamber and headspace could cause extraction issues or brass failure. Now, incidentally, you should only ever neck size cases that you're going to use in bolt action rifles, not semi-automatic rifles, because the chamber to chamber fit case to chamber fit could be too tight and cause feed issues, and that could cause another catastrophic issue in the semi-automatic, or just a feed issue. Now, if you don't know what neck sizing is or how to do it, again, plenty of videos online and articles on the web to tell you. Next is range pickup. Reloaders are nature's best friends because they're usually the ones that go and pick up all the brass that everyone else is too lazy to pick up. For most calibers, scavenging brass at the range isn't a big deal, but the same issues that present themselves in your Lee Enfield could very well be present in other people's rifles. Reloaders aren't lazy. They know the cost of brass, so they tend to pick up their brass. If you come across some 303 British lying on the ground, you should ask yourself, why didn't that reloader pick up their 303 British cases? Chances are that it's been fired multiple times and they just didn't want to be bothered to pick up brass that they knew was pretty much at the end of its lifespan. I'd be even leery of once fired brass that you pick up at the range, because again, you don't know the issues that their Lee Enfields may have with head spacing. This also goes maybe even doubly so for cheap gun show brass, which the bag promises once fired 303 British. Again, you have no idea how often that brass has actually been used, what issues those rifles had that the brass was produced by. I'd honestly give that stuff a pass. I've done it myself and always regretted buying once fired 303 British brass at gun shows. So yes, that means you're going to be buying your brass at the local gun store or online. It's not cheap, but I really recommend not playing around with used 303 British brass. I generally use brass manufactured by Prvi Partizan, or PPU as they're also well known, out of Serbia. For me, it strikes the right quality between price and quality. But you can also get brass from Cellier Ballot, Remington, I think Winchester, and others. Now, there are going to be some who disagree with me on genuinely once-fired brass. That's fair. I'm just, really careful with my rifles, and I do tend to caution when it comes to what I'm feeding them. Next is knowing when to throw away your brass. Speaking of tossing brass, you should recognize when it's time to call it a day for a particular batch of brass. For me, that is when a batch that I've used a number of times begins to manifest problems. If I have some brass out of a batch that I've reloaded a number of times for a rifle begin to show signs of incipient case head separation, or actual case head separation, or splitting on the neck, I tend to toss the entire batch. That entire batch has basically lived the same life as the ones that have failed, and chances are the next time you're going to see that exact same failure, and you're just creating issues for yourself. Now, I know that goes against the grain of the ethos that you'll always save money reloading, but remember, brass is almost always cheaper than the rifle that it's being fired out of. Lee Enfields are only getting more expensive, and you're really taking the risk of potentially damaging your rifle to squeeze one more reload out of a piece of brass that's worth 30 or 40 cents. And really, that's being penny wise and pound foolish. Next up is slugging your bore. This is where the difficulty ramps up a little bit. It's probably a good idea to slug your bore, and what that basically entails is taking a soft lead ball, although I've heard some people use wax as well, and using a rubber mallet and just basically forcing it into the bore, usually at the crown of the barrel. Upon retrieval of that lead slug and measurement, you're going to actually find out the diameter of your bore, and then you can choose proper bullet size. Lee Enfield bores can vary in diameter, which means you could be using a bullet, which means it measures anywhere from 0.038 inches all the way out to 0.0315 inches. Most Lee Enfield bores do tend to be about 0.311 or 0.312 inches, but there is always a variability. Choosing the proper bullet means you're going to be getting more accurate shooting from your rifle. If you don't want to slug your bore, going the middle ground and using a 0.311 inch bullet is probably the best idea, but until you actually do a slug of your bore, you won't know that that's the actual proper size. Now, if you want to know about slugging a bore or a chamber, again, videos and articles abound on the internet. At any rate, just some helpful tips for reloaders, reloading the 303 British cartridge. I hope you found the video vaguely informative and interesting. If you did, feel free to give it a like and a share. If I missed something or made a mistake, please feel free to leave a comment below. I always appreciate feedback, and I may learn something that I don't know. That's always possible. And when it comes to the reloading world, you will always learn something that you didn't know. You'll also find links to my Facebook and Twitter pages below. Feel free to check them out. As always, happy shooting, safe shooting.